What's up, everybody? Welcome to another episode of China Update, where I provide you guys with the most up-to-date political, economic, and geostrategic analysis on the world's number 2 economy. My name is Tony. Let's jump in. Okay, happy Friday, everybody. The weekend is almost upon us. I hope you all have a well-deserved, restful weekend ahead. On Thursday, Japanese and Taiwanese, and then soon after US media, was reporting that Nancy Pelosi, Speaker of the US House of Representatives, was going to lead an official visit to Taiwan next week. This would be the first official visit of its kind in over 2 decades, and would also be viewed with Beijing as a highly provocative act. Indeed, some Washington-based commentators have warned that flirting with the PRC red lines around Taiwan risks further military escalation in the region. Others, however, have pointed out that with escalation already occurring, the US needs to send stronger signals that it stands behind Taiwan, even if it is just for a deterrence effect. We will look at how Beijing responded to the news in a bit. However, by yesterday evening, we learned that Pelosi had to postpone the trip due to testing positive for COVID-19. So for now, what would have been a serious diplomatic crisis between the US and China, with real chances of escalation through saber-rattling, has been avoided. There is still fallout in the air, however. Before the trip was postponed, it was reported that Pelosi would arrive in Taipei this Sunday, following a visit to Japan. It would be the first time by a serving US House Speaker since Newt Gingrich traveled to Taiwan in 1997. However, at that time, Bill Clinton was president, so the visit could not have been seen as having the blessing of the White House, unlike Pelosi, who was traveling during the Biden administration. Also, the China of 1997 is not exactly the China of 2022. This visit too would come hot on the heels of another US trip to Taiwan, made by a bipartisan group led by former chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, Michael Mullen, in February, which was soon followed the next day with the arrival of former Secretary of State Michael Pompeo for a private visit. These were former officials, however. Now, let's look at Beijing's response to the first news of the trip. Quote, "If Pelosi, a political leader of the United States, knowingly visits Taiwan, it would be a malicious provocation against China's sovereignty and gross interference in China's internal affairs, and would send an extremely dangerous political signal to the outside world." End quote. Hu Xijin, the highly influential former editor-in-chief of the state-run Global Times, penned a fiery editorial yesterday too, shortly after news of the trip was being reported, expressing, quote, "While the crisis in Ukraine is still ongoing, the US is deliberately taking the offensive towards China. China cannot back down this time." End quote. He called for the People's Liberation Army Air Force to basically impose a de facto no-fly zone across Taiwanese airspace on Sunday and send aircraft, quote, "in the direction of Pelosi's plane," end quote. Now, this is just an editorial. It's very unlikely that Beijing would do anything like that if the trip had gone ahead. However, there would likely be saber-rattling of some sort, which, if ambitious, normally increases the risk of mistake or miscalculation, and then of course the risk of escalation. In a less exercised piece after the postponement of the trip was reported, the same publication wrote, quote, "The US may think that they are smart and think that Pelosi's Taiwan island trip will increase the leverage for dialogue with China, but they will do nothing but mess things up. China will definitely respond forcefully, otherwise the US will push it further, and the US should not doubt and underestimate China's determination and courage." End quote. 4 People's Liberation Army Air Force aircraft entered Taiwan's Air Defense Identification Zone on Thursday, shortly after the initial reports of the visit. Now, while we are on this general theme of security concerns, there is one other thing I wanted to quickly touch on. In a special meeting of NATO yesterday, the alliance announced that China will be added to the scope of its security concerns. NATO Secretary General expressed at a press conference that, quote, "Ministers agreed that NATO's next strategic concept must deliver a response on how we relate to Russia in the future. And for the first time, it must also take account of how China's growing influence and coercive policies affect our security." End quote. The meeting, which discussed the expansion of NATO's security forces, was joined by NATO's Asia-Pacific partners, Australia, Japan, New Zealand, and the Republic of Korea. The NATO members agreed to, quote, step up our practical and political cooperation in several areas, including cyber, new technology, and countering disinformation. End quote. Now, as we look at this, let's remember too, Chinese domestic media has now been aggressively pushing a narrative for several weeks that the Russian war in Ukraine was due entirely to US-led NATO expansion. This has been the narrative that we've seen coming from the People's Republic of China domestically. State media has pushed the idea of a Russia acting on the defensive. Now, if you are a policymaker in Beijing who has been sitting in this kind of information environment, and then you see an expansion of NATO like this that focuses on China, you may just start hearing conspiratorial bells ringing in your head. This could cause more than some to miscalculate how to address, say, an official US trip to Taiwan and advocate a disproportionate response. We will continue to keep our eyes on both the NATO development vis-a-vis China, as well as Pelosi or any other potentially provocative or controversial official US trips to Taiwan. Hey guys, as always, it's a huge help if you hit the like button. If you're enjoying the content, it really does help the channel. And if you want to go the extra mile, guys, I have my Patreon and buy me a coffee link in the description below. I'm the only one who makes these episodes, and this way of support, if you have the resources to do so, is a great way to help keep the channel sustainable. And if you're watching for the first time and you're enjoying the content, you're getting some value from the content, maybe consider subscribing. If you hit that bell notification, you'll have the most up-to-date analysis when I release these every day. And just generally, everybody who's watching this, thank you so much for your ongoing support. Okay, let's move on to the situation in Shanghai. And the situation there remains grim, and it is getting harder to see how the lockdown ends anytime soon. People in Changchun in the northeast of the country have been in lockdown for almost a month, and the situation there is still not under control. According to Shanghai's Health Commission, the city reported nearly 20,000 new local infections on Wednesday, compared to a little over 17,000 the previous day, and then today, Thursday's new case numbers climbed to 21,000. These are officially recognized cases. Shanghai government officials have recently acknowledged that tens of thousands of families are struggling to secure food and other necessities due to disruptions in delivery capacity caused by the lockdown. With the arrival of the People's Liberation Army and assistance from other parts of the country, however, food and medical services provisions generally should begin to improve in the next few days, especially after the weekend, for central districts in Shanghai. However, this can only be sustained if the virus does not spread to other regions nearby. Indeed, yesterday evening, the chief medical expert of the Chinese Center for Disease Control and Prevention admitted in a statement on social media that the Shanghai situation has, quote, far exceeded what the capacity of the local medical system can handle, end quote. Keep in mind too that Shanghai is one of the best resource cities in the country, so poorer cities are much more vulnerable if they have to go through a similar lockdown to Shanghai. And there are already smaller outbreaks across the country, with 26 other regions experiencing lockdowns and outbreaks of varying degrees. Manufacturing involved in critical international supply chains is now really being hit hard. The Wall Street Journal reports, for example, that about 30 miles away from Shanghai, a 3-day lockdown was imposed late Tuesday in Kunshan, a city of 2 million people that is a critical manufacturing base for electronics components used in mobile phones, computers, and automobiles. Over the weekend, Kunshan officials started asking factories to shut down temporarily, with at least 40 Taiwan-based electronic manufacturers affected as of Wednesday this week. Trucking, the airports, both Pudong and Hongqiao, and the port in Shanghai are all under tremendous pressure. The executive vice president and global head of air freight procurement at DSV expressed to UK-based Financial Times yesterday, quote, basically, everything else is not moving, but is being diverted away from Shanghai to other parts of China. It's affecting every commodity you can think of. It will have a global effect on almost every trade. End quote. Last up, the Chinese economy, and let's talk about a couple of key areas: capital outflows and the vulnerabilities of China to Western sanctions, if it ever came to that. We've been following the surprisingly high levels of capital flows out of China in recent months. Indeed, even some in Beijing have expressed discomfort with the trend, which has continued, albeit at a slower rate, in March. We learned this week that China's foreign reserve holdings amounted to $3.188 trillion at the end of March, down $25.8 billion or 0.8% from the end of February. China's foreign exchange regulator, the State Administration of Foreign Exchange, or SAFE, has been telling financial media outlets, both domestically and those overseas who will listen, that there is nothing to worry about with these outflows. Quote, affected by changes in the external environment, the fluctuation of foreign investment in domestic stocks and bonds has increased, which is normal given the complex international economic and financial situation. The short-term fluctuation of cross-border securities investment does not represent a reversal of the long-term trend of foreign investment in China's capital market. End quote. A state regulator is obviously going to insist that everything is okay. However, some international banks also appear to be not too concerned with the trend either. Quote, it's true that China has seen substantial outflows in equity and bond investments since the war in Ukraine broke out in late February, but equity and bond flows are only a small fraction of China's overall capital flows. End quote. Whatever the case, we will continue to follow Chinese capital flows in the coming months. Now, while we're here, one more thing. Western sanctions on Russia in response to the latter's invasion of Ukraine have in recent weeks caused several influential figures in China, including former central bank advisor and prominent Chinese economist Yu Yongding and former vice chairman of the Bank of China Wang Yongli, to warn about the effect of Western sanctions and what they could have on China's investment in foreign securities. With Mr. Yu putting it bluntly, expressing in a blog post recently, quote, if China also encounters similar sanctions against Russia, its overseas assets may even face the danger of turning to zero. End quote. This may be the case, but experts say there is no real alternative for the country to invest its foreign exchange reserves. Quote, China's forex assets could turn to zero if US imposes sanctions, but what other choice does it have? End quote. Hey guys, I'd love to hear what you thought about some of the updates we covered in today's episode, so throw your comments below. Always love hearing from you. Thank you for watching. I'll see you next time.